We wanted to do was first give the panelists a chance in front of an audience to react to things they've heard from others today. Alysson, are you going to change anything you're doing? Whether others agree with Pat that there are no serious ethical questions other than worrying about the public right away. So any thoughts from the panelists? We'll start with that.
I can go first. I'll definitely change brain farms to something else.
Oh, good.
No, that was very insightful. And just to clarify, we were discussing, so those neurons, they do spike. I mean, you can patch clamp a single neuron in an organoid, and they behave electrophysiologically like a human neuron. So they, as far as we can tell, smells like neurons, behave like neurons, taste like neurons. So they're definitely, this kind of discussion we actually have a long time ago when scientists start to differentiate stem cells into neurons. And the criticism was, how do we know these are neurons? And actually, one of the crucial experiments to prove that they are neurons was to transplant those neurons in a mouse embryonic brain and let the animal sturm. Those neurons, they become fully integrated into the mouse brain. You can stimulate the mouse brain and see that they form actual connections to the host. So a human and a mouse can make synapses. So that was one of the proof that this can become fully mature neurons. The question for the organoids, obviously they are not embodied, they are outside. But as far as we can tell, I mean, everything suggests that they behave like neurons. All right, I'll stop here.
So I did have one thought, and that is that ultimately it would be nice to be able to transplant organoid tissue into a human who had a brain disorder of some kind, let's say a stroke or a lesion or a Parkinson's. So we've talked a little bit about this, but let's suppose that it's somewhere in V1. Or if you like, further up the visual hierarchy, V4, V5 or something. So you take these and you put it into my V4, and the ones you're putting in, of course, have not lived my life. They haven't learned to identify a boxer from a Burmese mountain dog. So how do you think, I mean, like, presumably they'll set up housekeeping in some way. But will they, do you think, sort of, be able to categorize things that I haven't been able to categorize since the lesion?
I think it'll be similar to what happens when people first got cornea transplant 50 or 60 years ago. There are some people who are born with eyes, but they as babies already, they had such dense corneas that they effectively were born without visual input. And then later on as adults, when sight became available to them because they got this transplant, early on they had great difficulty dealing with vision, and literally their brain had to wire itself up. In us it happens, when we're born the first several months. But in these adults, it took much longer. So I assume in your case, Pat, if you had this done early on, you would have to retrain yourself. So one would hope that this cortical organoid had rules of plasticity, like LTP, like spike time-dependent plasticity. And then you would have to go through this training, this remedial process after your stroke. You get this new brain, then you have to go through a remedial process where it trains itself up. But ultimately, if it's a real thing, it should integrate smoothly.
That seems reasonable, we are continually amazed by the plasticity of brain tissue.
And by the way, that would be like a functional test for those neurons, again, to fully integrate it into a network. Yeah.
It might be more difficult if it were frontal structure. So if it was somewhere in the PFC, somewhere up here. Which apparently we use for so-called executive function. That might take a while. I might have to wander around the world and get into trouble quite a bit in order for my brain to tune itself.
You get to relive your teenage years. And do stupid stuff.
Yeah, right?
But will you be responsible for your actions?
Yes, you're older than 18. My organoid made me do it.
That's right.
So anybody have questions from the audience? We would want you to definitely use the microphone so everybody can hear you.
I think there is an ethical question already now, just because it's sort of demonstrated by the talks in a way, because what we've heard is just three different theories of what it takes to be conscious or sentient, and they're different, right? So we've got a kind of information processing one, a kind of similar anatomical one from Pat, and embodiment one. If we then try to apply those to the animal kingdom, we'll see that probably they're going to make they'll disagree over certain critters. Will score differently on these things, and so for those critters, if we were experimenting on them, if we were say looking at an octopus, and if we did an anatomical one, maybe it might not look like sufficiently like us or that, but maybe it might score very highly on information processing or embodiment. And so then we would have an ethical question about what to do, whether we're allowed to do that with the octopus or maybe it's a fly or whatever. Then given that uncertainty over which is the right theory, don't we then have an ethical challenge right before us then, given that we don't, we're in the face of this uncertainty?
Look, we all exist in the face of uncertainty. So, for instance, most theories I know assume that all of us, I think, agree that all mammals are conscious. Yet most of us continue to happily eat the flesh of animal, although we all know they are raised under atrocious conditions. So, people are perfectly willing to live with these inconsistencies. And that
but there is an ethical question about whether you should eat animals.
Yes, I think there is one, and I think there's an obvious answer. But people continue to continue to exist without delving into these and contradictions. If you're going to wait until there's a final, well-established theory of consciousness that every philosopher and scientist wait on, it ain't going to happen.
Well, I'm not saying to wait, but I'm just saying that there is this ethical issue then. I mean, just as there is, so we have that same ethical issue with the animal, with eating. So I'm just saying that in experimenting, so we have that. It seems like we're in that situation. So I'm not saying I know the answer or that we should wait for the answer, but
this ethical issue has been with us for a long time. I mean, it's been with us. I mean, as Christof mentioned, I mean, since animal experimentation has arisen, at least it's been with us since then. I mean, one of the, I don't know what to call it, one of the conundrums or paradoxes of a lot of consciousness research is that when we're not researching on human beings, we research on animals like monkeys precisely because we think that they, have aspects of conscious experience like ours, but nonetheless we, do all sorts of things to them that if we were really weighting their interests and their sentience, we might not do. So I think those problems are with us anyway, independently of theories of consciousness that we can debate about in the lab or in the armchair.
I think ultimately, I mean, as practicing neuroscientists, it has to be about a utilitarian position has to be about the minimization of suffering of all of us. So the only true justification can't be, well, I'm just curious and I want to know, and so in the pursuit of this egotistical drive to know, I'm going to sacrifice thousands of animals. But it has to be ultimately, if we want to understand and minimize the suffering that's autism and schizophrenia, etc., we have to do these experiments, and we have to do it with compassion, realizing these are not just reagents, but these are conscious creatures. They sacrifice their life for us, so we have to treat them with care and with compassion. I think that's the only legitimate way of doing this.
So my question is for Koch, and it starts with this diagram that you made where you put consciousness on one axis and intelligence on the other. And then you say intelligence is about, these are different, and intelligence is more artificial intelligence. And the consciousness, the brain organoids, you put then with the consciousness axis. And so at that point, I was remembered to the robot again from you, and where you have this robot training the organoids, and I was reminding myself of a thesis committee that I just participated in, where somebody made a soft robot and then trained the computer to, and it looked like exactly the same as this organoid was trained, but the computer was trained with some programs called Q-learning to walk. So I was, I'm just wondering, my question is, so what is the difference between training these organoids and training a computer program, and maybe even these organoids are going to be our new type of computers, or what is the two axes, shouldn't be the organoids on the intelligence axis.
Well, no, so in principle, what all this new technology gives us, it allows us to populate the entire, I call it the IC plane, the intelligence consciousness plane, that through natural evolution by natural selection, we have sort of this monotonic relationship between the complexity of a brain, its intelligence, and its ability to consciously experience the world. But now, we have at least, I claim, two instances of engineered system. One, current, deep mind, including, the Q algorithm, that's sort of purely on the intelligence axis without feeling like anything. On the other hand, we're beginning to build brain organoids that right now at least have no I/O, so there's no intelligence because there's no behavior, but they may be conscious. But now, of course, we can merge these technologies, right? We can do cyborgs, we can do brain-machine interfaces, we can do organoid brain interfaces. So in principle, we could populate this entire plane where you might end up have engineered creatures that have high level of consciousness as well as high level of intelligence. I mean, and science fiction is full of that. The androids of Blade Runner, for instance, right? The replicants, they are sort of supposedly some sort of bioengineered system, yet they're conscious. In fact, they're more conscious than humans.
My question is also to Professor Koch. You, as well as Ned Block, divide consciousness as phenomenal and access consciousness. And I'm wondering how to justify the being of this phenomenal consciousness. What type of phenomenological content is there? Is there any form of intentionality in this phenomenal content? And in that case, it would be just another name for access consciousness itself. How to justify this phenomenal consciousness that has no intentionality, if that is the case?
So access consciousness is just a subset of phenomenal consciousness, right? If you ask me what do I see right now, I can describe certain things, but that's just a small subset of everything I actually see. And I think by definition that has intentionality. I don't see how I could dissociate those two. And so the question is, do these things have phenomenal consciousness? And if they do, then it will be about something. It will be about color or space or whatever they feel. So I think, yes, they will have intentionality. I don't think that's an additional property above and beyond.
So it seems like there's at least two different kinds of questions that have been banging around in some of the discussion. So one is, what are the kinds of things that constitute or are required for, or the kind of that are required for consciousness? And then there's the set of moral ethical questions about when are there worries about these technologies and their deployment that are lurking here. And those questions might overlap or come apart in lots of interesting ways, and there's lots of ways in which real-world practices might be morally dubious, or things that we can raise intelligible questions about. But I take it that at least at the polar opposite ends of the spectrum, we have no problems turning on and off mechanical devices. We don't think there's anything morally vexed about that. In the case of human beings, if we're turning on and off consciousness as is convenient for our purposes, we begin to get more worrisome about that if other people are doing it to someone else. So for those of you who are actively working on these kinds of things, and maybe this is a question for Alysson first and foremost, about, what keeps you up at night? What's the point at which the technology of the organoid mechanical interface gets to a point where you think, maybe I should be thinking more about this before we flip that switch? What would it take for you to think, here's a place where I start to get uncomfortable without more reflection?
Yeah, so that's a great question. My goal, and I think most of the neurosciences in the biomedical field, is really to create some quality of life for people who are suffering from neurological disorders, right? So to get to that point, you really need to improve your model. And we have a history of bad modeling, especially with animal models that didn't took us that far. We learn a lot of things, but the translational ability of these models are something that we're not happy with. So we and I think some of in this field sees the brain organoids as perhaps a complementary solution to the models that we already have. So ultimately, I want to get as close as possible to the realistic endpoint, to the human brain. So I'll get there because that's how I will understand a disease brain happens. I might not need to get there if I understand how the disease starts in the first place. So maybe the early embryonic phases is where all the problems related to schizophrenia or autism appears, and I can fix it later on by just knowing what happens in the early stages. But that might not be the case for all kinds of diseases. It might be that you need a full-form cortex with a thalamus to understand schizophrenia, right? So my inclination is to go as far as I can to the realistic model. I definitely understand the ethical implications that will get there, and I don't know when would be a moment to pause and stop, and that's why we're having this meeting. And I don't expect that we're going to leave here, this room, with a clear answer. I think it's just the beginning of a conversation, right? But definitely there is a moment where we're going to give a moral status to these organoids. And I think that's the time when we're going to have to create rules and regulations, as we do for human subjects in clinical trials or animals for research. These brain organoids, we have to decide how many are important to answer your question. How would you dispose them in a more perhaps humanized way? So all the same rules that we do for animal research or human subjects in clinical trial. I think we'll get there. I think science is evolving in a fast pace in this field. I'm not too surprised that in the next 5-10 years, we're going to learn how to vascularize those things, how to plug the different pieces, cortical, thalamus, and generate circuitries in there. I think we're going to get there. It might be earlier than we think.
So I want to follow up on my question before, and back to on the same thought. I think many of us, when we were seeing Alysson's presentation of the parts of the brain in the dish, I think, okay, it's just in a dish, and I don't know much about the philosophy of consciousness, but when I saw Brad Wojtek's spider robot, I intuitively thought, uh-oh, okay. And so now I have a word for this, embodiment basically is required. So my question is the one thing that's missing from watching that little film of the spider thing walking around is evidence that it could suffer? So, I mean, and I, imagine like it's a space that's this big and if it keeps hitting against the wall because it wants to escape and it's, frustrated or whatever, but like is that the one piece of evidence that robot is missing that would then be evidence for you that it has consciousness?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So, I mean, I would need to know more of the details of what's going on in that particular interface, but correct me if I'm wrong, but it as I understood it, it's not a situation in which you have, you don't have the kind of sort of intimate sensory motor interface that you would have when the system is regulating its own sensory motor activity, and that sensory motor activity is regulating its own neuronal activity. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. So it looked to me as if it was a kind of informational, link, but it didn't have that kind of tight coupling. Were it to develop to have that kind of tight coupling, then I would be inclined to say, oh, now we're in the presence of a system that has a certain kind of, let's call it autonomy or, self-regulative capacity that would be what I would think would be required for us to talk about a system with interests. Let's put it that way. Now, what the relationship of that is precisely to sentience in the sense of the capacity to feel pain and suffer is still a tricky question because, I mean, that takes us into the zone again where we don't really have a worked out biological understanding of the relationship of those two things, say organismic self-regulation and sentience or consciousness. But we'd be much closer to a situation where I would think, well, that's the kind of system where it has a kind of I would call it a kind of biological or functional autonomy. And in the case of those kinds of systems, then I would have all sorts of ethical questions would come up for me.
I wouldn't have any ethical questions.
Oh, good. Okay.
And here's why. My Roomba does all those things.
Your what? Sorry?
My Roomba, my vacuum, my autonomous vacuum cleaner runs around the room. It gets feedback.
No, it doesn't.
It finds certain things aversive. It never goes there again. I mean, it learns.
No, not really. I don't think so.
The main reason.
The bugs in your room do. Yeah.
The main reason is that it's got no thalamus. It doesn't have the enabling structures that we so far believe are necessary. Now, it might turn out, as we know more and more about reptiles, that we'll find that, you don't need a thalamus. All you need is, ventral pallidum or something. But at the moment, it doesn't have the enabling structures. And it's, not quite, a Roomba is not quite there, but it's pretty darn close. And I have no compunction about kicking my Roomba when I'm angry. Just, haul off and, anyway, yeah.
There's an instructive difference if you look at the reaction to a noxious, painful stimuli between some insects and mammals. So let's say if you work on a cricket and you cut its leg because you want to insert an electrode, then the leg sort of tries to push off the scalpel, a local reflex. But the locus continues to eat up front. So up front it eats while it's sort of its leg. So there's no central state. It seems to be a local reflex. While if you do that for more advanced, so for example for bee, or certainly for a mammal like a mouse would do everything it can to fight off that. So it's a much more centralized. So just because there's a very simple aversive reflex, that by itself doesn't signal. But if it's really centralized, if it seems to interfere with everything else that creature does, then it's one of many criteria that I think indicate that there's something more there than just a local reflex.
So I have a question for Pat. So I think in response to a question earlier, you mentioned that you thought we should avoid getting bogged down by hypothetical concerns. And
I probably shouldn't have said that, but anyway.
Well, yeah, so my question is, at what point should we start worrying? Because, once you have something where there is widespread agreement that something has moral consideration, it's sort of too late to start thinking about where the limits are on research. It makes sense to try and work these things out beforehand, even if that does mean that you slow down research while you try and work these things out beforehand. So I think there's a question there about, when do we start trying to work these things out?
Yeah, it's not that I think that you shouldn't, have foresight and plan for the future. It's just that there are some questions that are so far in the future, they're so unconstrained that it's just not productive to spend a lot of time whacking away at them. But if they are significantly constrained, then of course it can be very important and very useful. I mean, partly the way I look at it too is that, in our lives there are many, many huge moral, practical questions. And perhaps this is even more true in the last decade here. So there are many practical questions, and when someone, tries to take my afternoon by asking me to speculate about what would I do if Jeffrey Epstein wanted to have his brain recreated in a dish, and would, in order to make this happen, would pay MIT $100 million or whatever it turned out to be. I guess I'm going to go back to some of the practical questions that are really, really demanding. So I wish I could answer your question by saying, here is the point, here is the cutoff. But these are judgment questions. And we all have to, use our judgment as best we can. But I guess I felt that as a philosopher for so many years, I got trapped into, and I realize I said this before, but I got trapped into thinking about thought experiments that in retrospect were just ridiculous, like Chalmers' zombie experiment, thought experiment. I mean, as Francis used to say, there's too much thought and not enough experiment. And so there isn't a good answer to your question. And some people have more tolerance than I have for really far out, unconstrained speculations. And sometimes those speculations, maybe in physics, for example, might turn out to be quite useful. And sometimes in neuroscience, they might turn out to be quite useful. So I don't want to say nobody should ever do it. It's just that my own personal preference is I don't like to waste my time on questions that are totally unconstrained, like the trolley problem, if I may take another really stupid example of a time-wasting thing in moral philosophy. That's my 2 bits worth.
I have a question that is maybe too sci-fi, and I apologize if it doesn't even make sense, because I didn't know about organoid until this morning, so I may be asking something that is based on a wrong assumption. But as my understanding, for you to make an organoid, you must have stem cells, right?
That's correct.
That comes from someone.
It can come from different sources, but yes. Yeah.
Okay, so based on the principle that the stem cells come from someone, and you use them to make an organoid, and let's say that you are able to create an organoid that may develop to have a conscience or be sentient or something like this. How do you think that is the ethical implications regarding the person who gave the cells in the first place? I mean, like informed consent or something like this, because when the person gave you the cells to create a stem cell, to make the organoid, she might not have think about it yes, I'm going to create an organoid who has a conscience and is a like person. And I just was thinking about it, maybe this is way too sci-fi, but
no,
that was what kept staying in my mind.
It's a real practical question, because my language has evolved. In the past, my consent forms would say you will take cells from you or your kid with this disease to make brain cells in my lab. Now I have to evolve that language, and then I add, I can also make a brain organoid, and I explain what is a brain organoid. Now my language has evolved even more. Now I would say that there is a remote possibility, but there is a possibility that some of these organoids will achieve consciousness. We don't know. We don't even agree on how to measure that. But that's in my consent form. The question now is, are the families or the subjects fully aware, or do they understand what I'm saying? And I try to explain as much as I can, but I don't know if they would grasp all the complexity of what they're signing up.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's very possible that they don't fully understand what is the ramifications. But it's a good surprise for me that you actually think about it, way before it happens, but you have an informed consent that you put this, so you kind of let people know that, okay, that might happen. And even though you might not understand what this really means, it's here, and they are signing for this. So
that's correct, because I think most people, they see the goals of the research, and that's what I always say. I mean, this is try to benefit people with the same disease as your child or as you, and then I mean, these all the details I think becomes secondary, because they want a cure, they want a treatment, they want a science to progress. But
legally, who do they belong to, these brain organoids? Do they belong to the donor or to you or to?
In theory, they belong to the university.
Not to the donor.
Not to the donor. All the when they sign, I mean, all the materials would belong to the university. They waive all the rights to the research. Yeah.
I have a quick question. So, my background is in cord blood transplants. So, in the case if you were to receive a family member gave you a sample of their child, once that child becomes 18, who owns that? Would it still be the university because now the child is 18 years old and now they own that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. You might answer them better than me. If I fully understand, I mean, the parent gives the consent for that. That's correct, yeah. And let's suppose, and most of my work is really on neurological conditions where the kids cannot really, even if they become 18, cannot respond by themselves. But in conditions that are more subtle, that they can withdraw from the research. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, well, we need a lawyer here to be sure, but my understanding is that the informed consent documents, whether parents signing for a child or for yourself, are written to say, as Alysson said, that you're providing materials to this research project. All rules indicate that those data, those materials belong to the institution, even though Alysson is probably going to be the one who decides what to do with them. So I think that would be, you'd be stuck in some senses.
Oh, and just one small clarification. When they sign, they have the right to withdraw from the study at any point. So if the child becomes 18, said, I don't want my cells again in the Muotri lab, so he can ask for whoever signed the consent to withdraw from the research, knowing that these cells might be already distributed to others, and I will not have access to destroy all the cells that has been distributed.
John.
I have a question. So Pat has some brain preconditioned structures for consciousness. My question for Alysson is, how much scientific development would we need for you to be able to grow those components in the lab?
Yeah, so we were discussing that. Like, for example, there is a student in the lab trying to make that cortical thalamus connection. How good is the thalamus that we can create from stem cells? Doesn't have all the sub-regionalization of the thalamus that you would expect in a fully mature brain. But we do have some markers suggesting that, yeah, these are most thalamic neurons. And as far as we can tell, there's another group who actually showed that they can interact with each other. So this has been done already. So our own limitation is to know the signals or the factors that are required to recreate the specific structures in the brain. As we learn more how to do that, I think we can do it. The cells are pluripotent. They have the capacity to become anything as long as you know how to guide them. We know how to guide it for the cortex. The thalamus, we are learning how to do it. We're going to get better over time. So science, it's hard to predict. It might go super slow. It might jump eventually, and we learn how to make all the pieces at once. Yeah.
So Pat, your previous principle was we will extend, once we know what required for human consciousness, we'll generally err on the side of caution and grant that same perspective to all mammals, because mammals have these preconditions, et cetera, et cetera. If he was to show you a brain in a dish that actually had those components, we wouldn't have any way of knowing consciousness, but having the structures that are the prerequisites, would that be enough in your evaluation to err on the side of caution and think this has the potential for consciousness even though it's just the structures?
I would think that if, and it wouldn't just be the thalamus, of course, because brainstem structures are important, although Christof, I think, thinks you could just, pour in the serotonin or the
well, not pour, but yes.
Well, literally sprinkle. But then, I think we would have to take it all very seriously. But let me just also say that connecting thalamus to cortex is a tricky thing because there's many parts to the thalamus. There's this rind on the outside, there's the intralaminar on the inside, then there's a very specific nuclei like for vision, for touch, and so on. And they connect to cortex. If it's visual cortex, for example, there's also feedback. on the order of about 10 times as many fibers going back as going forward. So you'd have to make sure you had the whole kit and caboodle, as it were. But were that to happen, then I think we would be in the domain where we would seriously have to ask whether or not the thing there had some form of consciousness. And then I think I agree with Christof that the real question is it suffering? I mean, probably we don't care too much if it's happy, if it's, as he said, hanging out in the dish. That could be a better life for lots of us. But if it's suffering, then yeah, we will have to find the means to determine that. Yeah.
But we also have to be careful that we don't get too much hung up on humans. There are cases of parallel evolution where other creatures evolved also consciousness, having very different structures. So if you look at octopus, anybody, there are lots of things. You can see all those fantastic YouTube videos, for octopus taking a shell and hiding. They have all the behavioral hallmarks of that we take in humans would instantly assume it's conscious, including learning from individual. They can look at another octopus and learn from its behavior. They have a very complicated nervous system, highly distributed. So, I find it very difficult to say, well, a priori, it doesn't have a thalamus, it doesn't have my brain or our brain structure, therefore it can't be conscious, right? Then we have to, this is why ultimately we need a more general theory of consciousness to tell us which type of nervous systems, or maybe even non-nervous system, which type of causal interaction in any system, in any mechanism give right to conscious experience. Once we go out there, under alien stars, there's going to be all sorts of weird stuff going down, and we need to understand under what condition can you get conscious experience.
I agree with that, actually, and I wouldn't say if you don't have a thalamus, you aren't conscious. I would just say if you don't have a thalamus or a brain stem, we don't know. That's the most you can say. But I certainly take your point. But the thing of it is that we probably won't be able to answer the question about consciousness in invertebrates or reptiles or octopus until we know a huge amount more about the brain itself. And at the moment, there's these big outstanding questions, these huge gaps. I mean, we still don't even know how people recollect information. I'll ask you, do you remember where you parked your car? And the answer will come right up into your head. We have no idea how that's done. So there's huge gaps in our knowledge in neuroscience. And that's part of what I mean when I say that sometimes unconstrained thought experiments kind of drive me nuts.
Well, but once again, we've seen in medicine, our progress can be very rapid in the absence of knowing fundamental mechanism, right? Most progress in medicine occurs without really understanding the basis. We have now, many of you will have seen a couple of months ago, was on front page of New York Times, reversibility of death in pig, right? That you can take a pig brain, you leave it in a slaughterhouse for 4 hours, you bring it back into the Yale, Nestana at Yale, right? You attach the brain to a sort of dialysis machine for blood. It recirculates, and then you can sort of, this brain now shows some simple signs of electrical activity in individual cells. In a sense, you can take little sliver of this dead brain tissue, and you can now show it shows electrical activity. And structurally, it looks relatively like a normal brain. It has an immune response. It begins to have a vascular response. So suddenly, what used to be irreversible, we all know death is irreversible. Well, maybe isn't. It's usually irreversible, but maybe not always irreversible. So now if you have dad, who just died, you have to worry, is it okay to give my dad's brain to donation, and what are they going to do with it? So science moves very rapidly, in particular in this field. So I think we need to think about these things now, as we're doing.
The four of you seem absolutely totally adequate, more than adequate to talk about issues involving ethics. I mean, I think you're demonstrating here that science is fully capable of handling and looking at the ethics of what it does. That said, I'd love to know what this panel thinks about whether or not the issue of ethics and science is a topic that is totally isolated just to the scientific community and perhaps some very highly trained philosophers as well, or whether it is or should be an interface between the science and the non-science community as far as where we go. I so appreciated the discussion about what we say about brain farms and things like that. But I think the bigger issue is we all know that down the line, this kind of science could lead to the creation of artificial brains and reprogrammed brains. And so we don't want to talk about that right now, but we do know where this might head. What does the scientific community feel about the issues that it needs to address as far as ethics are concerned? And do you need to go outside the community necessarily and interface with the non-scientific community to come to some conclusions?
Absolutely. We need to talk to as many stakeholders as we can in the community, among politicians who write the laws, among lawmakers, among religious communities, ethicists, everybody, because everybody out there at some point in their life, they may be confronted with this ethical dilemma in some shape, way, or form.
And I might add to that. I mean, I think that engaging the community is super important. And not just because, you want to forestall complaints down the line, but I think there's just a lot of wisdom there, actually. I think it's unlikely that there are, so to speak, real moral experts. I think there are people who might have read a lot of the literature on the nature of morality and so on, but I don't think there are moral experts. Everybody grows up in a community. People come to understand how to navigate the social world. They understand things about what's right and what's wrong. And sometimes there's a lot of wisdom just in, the folks I meet at Dog Beach. So I think we need to engage the wider community because there is a lot of wisdom there and because these things will have a great impact there and they need to know.
Yeah. And there is lots about public perception, right? I mean, ultimately, that's the public perception that tell us how far we go. From the stem cells, the examples we have, for example, Dolly the clone, I think got people by surprise. The society was not expecting to see a clone right there. We scientists, we know this was coming. People were researching, isolating nuclei, enucleating cells, stem cells, but suddenly, boom, Dolly the clone. So that creates a major impact in society. I think this initiative here is just trying to avoid something like that. So we are preparing the society for something to come. I think we're learning from our mistakes in the past.
Yeah, no, it seems very reasonable.
I should weigh in just briefly on that question as well, because here in San Diego, since 2004, we've had this Center for Ethics in Science and Technology, which I think is still an unusual effort to do exactly what you just described. Have scientists talking about what they're doing that's at the cutting edge, hearing from the public about what their worries are, but at the same time also helping to educate them about things that are going on so that they're brought up to speed. And then also together identifying strategies that might help to deal with it. And they may not be experts in the science or experts in the philosophy or ethical issues, but they can collectively help inform what people might think and do. And I guess Alysson is, this program is in part, I think, driven by his desire to figure out what he should be doing and having been part of one of those programs with the public.
I just wanted to ask, as a scientist, is it possible within the scientific community to conclude that we are not going down a certain road? Or is that so antithetical to science that you're going to go down every road you can find and we'll talk about the ethics as we go and we'll just let the chips fall where they may down the line, but I can't stop myself because it's there, so I'm going to explore it?
No, I think that the scientific community does do that. And I think the contemporary example, although it's slightly complicated, is the use of CRISPR-Cas9 on germ cells. And by and large, the community decided not to go down that route. Now, as you know, of course, there was a scientist in China who did it, but made such a mess of it and got such an outcry that it will, I think, be a long time before that happens again. Now, that's a prediction, and I could easily be wrong. But that is at least an example where the scientists came together and made that decision, and fairly quickly too, because it wasn't long after CRISPR was out that decision was made.
My question relates to suffering and ethics. Elon Musk recently proposed that we drop hundreds of nuclear bombs on Mars. He wants to create some kind of environment there. As far as we know, Mars cannot suffer. Do you think it is ethical?
And what's the role of brain organoids in that? So.
Yeah, well, does seem a bit strange. There are, of course, ethical issues that arise in the context of the environment. Logging old growth forest is another one. But I don't know, when I grew up on the farm, there were always boys out there with guns shooting magpies. They thought that was just the best fun ever. But people don't do that anymore. And maybe they'll think now, too, that they won't start trashing other planets now that we've successfully trashed this one.
I have one more question, if you don't mind. I'm an MBA candidate, and I really admire your spirit of being open and welcome to people to contribute in this discourse of stem cell ethics. But don't you feel concerned about the business world rushing into making profits in this area?
Why should I be concerned?
Oh, because they have no record of doing that ever before.
That's what they do, right?
Yeah, so the point is, in business, we normally don't look for implications of ethical dilemmas of issues. But like philosophy, it's obvious. Science, probably it's kind of obvious that you should think about what are the implications of your job. But in business, the focus is clear. No one pays us for ethics, but for philosophers, I think that's a focus.
I see. I think I understand your point. I mean, I think it's going to be exactly the same with animal research, right? There are private companies that do drug testing in animals. They do have to follow international laws on how to treat these animals. I think the organoids will get to a point where might be the same case, and they all have to follow the same regulations. Otherwise, they're breaking the law. If we are in a gray zone, if a company right now, maybe they already have a brain organoid that's already fully conscious and they're using in their own way, if that's a possibility, I don't think there is anything we can do it.
Let's say that in the future we will be able to simulate brain in a computer, and it will be a complex software definitely that needs testing. And okay, let's say I get consciousness of somebody by scanning his brain, and I will use the consciousness to test the software. Let's say I will just start the testing, the consciousnness appears there in the matrix, then checks, okay, it does what I needed to do, and then I stop that. What do you think about that? Is it, would you be okay with using somebody's consciousness like this? I don't know, maybe it's...
Wait, I'm sorry, so what is precisely the question?
Seems to me like one of the thought experiments that I don't think is productive.
It's actually a couple of episodes of Black Mirror, which you might want to watch.
It's just so wildly unconstrained. I mean, it's like it's a science fiction scenario. It's fun as science fiction. The science fiction stories can have ethical things that are, a source of ethical knowledge for us, but in and of itself, the scenario is just too wildly unconstrained to draw any conclusion from, I think.
But maybe, we go back to the point of the consent form, where the cells came from. And if you allowed scientists, whoever, to do whatever with that brain organoid, including projections of consciousness in a computer, yeah, if you sign off, maybe it's okay, you're protected somehow.
Protected legally. So I think we're supposed to just about wrap up, but it occurs to me we should do one last thing. So this program was driven in a meeting of what's called the Stem Cell Oversight Working Group at UC San Diego, which helped to look at the administrative challenges to stem cell research. And in a meeting of that group last year, Alysson said, if we're going to deal with ethical issues, because we had been dealing with them by a training requirement, which we decided we no longer needed for a variety of reasons, he said, why don't we have a program that's specifically relevant to what we're doing in research here? And he proposed as one example what he's working on, brain organoids. So that's the driving force for this program, which I took it to mean that Alysson wanted advice. He wanted to know, what should I do? What should I not be doing at this point? So we've heard one clear bit of advice, which is to watch his vocabulary. But so Christof, Pat, Evan, anything else you would recommend to Alysson and other scientists working in this area they should be thinking about now, not for some thought experiment in the future?
Do zip and zap. It would just be it would be a cool thing to do, no matter what the outcome
why
is.
not?
Yeah. And I bet you, as they become more differentiated, the PCI value will go up as they become more closer to this. No matter the effect, no matter the ethical implication, just empirically, scientifically, I think it's an exceedingly interesting experiment. And it's relatively straightforward to do.
Super.
I think that is a good idea. And if you do get the kind of results that Christof is suggesting, then we should have another meeting. Yeah. Because all kinds of different things could be taking place in the dish.
Yeah.
And we will want to know that, what exactly the facts are that might give a totally different interpretation to the zip and zap than that the thing in there is conscious. Yeah. Did you want to say?
I would just say this connects to your question. It's a good general principle to always remind oneself that what one thinks one's doing and what one thinks the consequences of what one's doing are going to be very often doesn't turn out to be that way. And we have lots of examples in the history of science of that, leading to both good and bad things. So it's just a good general meta principle, I would say. Yeah.
Okay, so well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to the audience for some great questions, and keep the conversation going.